What are those little lines over some of the letters in Spanish? Well, they're not just some fancy squiggle. Nope, they're a powerhouse that tells you exactly how to say things and what they mean. And if you miss them, well, your yes could turn into ith, and your he could turn into the. Sounds confusing, right? Well, you're definitely not alone, but what if you could crack the code? That's exactly what I'm going to teach you in this class. Don't go away. Hola and welcome to Spanish with a Güero. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, well, subscribe so that you don't miss any classes. And while you're at it, why don't you give this video a like? If you've ever been puzzled by those little marks hovering over Spanish vowels, wondering when to use them, where they go, and why they even matter, then you're in exactly the right spot. Lots of Spanish learners find accent marks, as they are called, super frustrating. They can feel totally random, just another hurdle in learning another language. But here's the cool part. They're not random at all. There's a system, a beautiful logic to Spanish accent marks. In this video, I'm going to clear up the mystery of Spanish accent marks once and for all. By the end, you'll see that getting accent marks right doesn't just make your Spanish better, it totally transforms it. So why all the fuss about a tiny line? How can it change everything? Well, Spanish accent marks mainly do two huge things. They tell you how to pronounce a word correctly, and they can completely change what a word means. First, let's talk about pronunciation. Spanish is an almost completely phonetic language, which means that words are usually pronounced exactly the way they are spelled. But just as in English and almost every language, every word with more than one syllable has one syllable that gets more stress or emphasis than the others. Sometimes this stress follows a natural, predictable pattern, but when it doesn't, that's when you need that little accent mark to tell you which syllable to hit a little harder. If you stress the wrong syllable, people might not even understand you, or you might just sound a little off. Now, besides telling you where to stress certain words, accent marks help you to differentiate between words that are pronounced exactly the same but mean something different. These are called homonyms. So now that we know the two reasons why we have accent marks, to tell us how to pronounce words and to differentiate between words that are pronounced the same, now we're ready to dive into the rules about when to use them. But before we do that, we need to understand how Spanish words naturally handle stress. Every Spanish word has one syllable that gets the main stress. The cool thing is, for most words, you can actually predict where that stress will fall without any need for written accent marks, just based on how the word ends. There are two main patterns for natural stresses in Spanish. First, if the word ends in a vowel, A, E, I, O, or U, or in an N or an S, then the stress naturally falls on the second to last syllable without any need for a written accent mark. Think of words like casa. Casa ends in an A, a vowel, and so the stress goes on the second to last syllable. Ca, casa. You can hear that I put a little bit more stress on that syllable than on the last one. Casa. Poco. Poco ends in an O, another vowel, and so the natural stress goes on the second to last syllable. Po. Poco. Examen. Examen ends with an N, and so just as in words that end in a vowel, the natural stress goes on the second to last syllable. Examen. 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 Lunes. Lunes ends with an S, and so again, the natural stress goes on the second to last syllable. Lunes. Lunes. In these words, there is no need for a written accent mark. The stress naturally falls on the second to last syllable. The second natural stress pattern for Spanish words is when a word ends with any other consonant besides N or S, then the stress naturally falls on the last syllable. For example, felicidad. Felicidad. This word ends with a D. It's not a vowel, and it's not an N or an S. And so the stress naturally falls on that last syllable, dad. felicidad. Comer, comer. This word ends with an R. It's not a vowel, and it's not an N or an S. And so the stress naturally falls on that last syllable. Comer. Papel, papel. This word ends with an L. It is also not a vowel, an N, or an S. And so the stress naturally falls on the last syllable. Papel. So if a word follows these natural stress patterns, you don't need a written accent mark. The pronunciation is clear from the spelling. The accent mark is only used when these natural rules are broken. All right, so now for the main event. When do you actually need to write that accent mark? Written accent marks, which, by the way, can only go over the vowels A, E, I, O, and U, are used in very specific situations. Let's break them down. So as I said before, the biggest reason you'll see an accent mark is when a word doesn't play by the natural stress rules that we just learned about. Remember, if a word ends in a vowel, an N, or an S, then the stress naturally falls on the second to last syllable with no need for a written accent mark. If a word ends in any other consonant besides N or S, then the stress falls naturally on the last syllable without the need for a written accent mark. But if a word ends in a vowel, an N or an S, and the stress is on any other syllable besides the second to last one, you must write an accent mark above the vowel in the stressed syllable. Here are some examples with words with the stress on the last syllable that need an accent mark. Ratón, ratón. This word ends with an N, so normally we would stress the second to last syllable. But in this word, we don't stress the second to last syllable. We stress the last one, and so we must put an accent mark above the O. Ratón. Jamás, jamás. This word ends with an S, and so naturally the second to last syllable would be stressed. But in this word, it is the last syllable that is stressed, and so we must write an accent mark above the A. Jamás. Colibrí, colibrí. This word ends in a vowel, and so naturally the second to last syllable would be stressed. But the last syllable is stressed, and so we have to write an accent mark above the I. Colibrí. It's the same with words like canción and papá. Canción ends with an N, and papá ends with an A, a vowel. And so normally we would stress the second to last syllable. But in each of these words, we stress the last syllable, and so we have to write an accent mark above that last vowel. Canción, papá. Here are some examples of words that have the stress on the second to last syllable that also need an accent mark. Ámbar, ámbar. This word ends in an R, and so normally the stress would be on the last syllable, but it's not. It's on the second to last syllable, and so we have to write an accent mark above that first A. Ámbar. Fácil, fácil. This word ends in an L, and so normally the stress would be on the last syllable, but it's not. It's on the second to last syllable, and so we have to write an accent mark above the A. Fácil. Álbum, álbum. This word ends in an M, and so the stress would normally be on the last syllable, but it's not. It's on the second to last syllable, so we have to write an accent mark above that A. Álbum. Huésped, huésped. This word ends in a D, and so also in this word, the stress would fall naturally on the last syllable. But it doesn't. It's on the second to last syllable, and so we must write an accent mark above the E. Huésped. So understanding the natural stress rules and words that break them will cover a huge chunk of your accent mark questions. Now, there are some Spanish words, quite a few actually, where the stress falls on a syllable that is not the second to last or the last. Sometimes it falls on the third to last or the fourth to last. The rule for these words is wonderfully simple. All of these words, with no exceptions, receive a written accent mark. You must write an accent mark above the vowel in the stressed syllable. There are no tricky ending rules to worry about. If the stress falls on a syllable before the second to last one, the word will always receive an accent mark. For example, fantástico, fantástico. In this word, we stress the third to last syllable, and so it must have a written accent mark. Fantástico. Pájaro, pájaro. In this word, we also stress the third to last syllable, so it must have an accent mark. Pájaro. It's the same in música and teléfono. Música, teléfono. In these two words, we also stress the third to last syllable, and so that vowel in that third to last syllable must have a written accent mark. Música, teléfono. So if the stress falls farther back than the second to last syllable, you know that you must write an accent mark. We also use accent marks to break up what would normally be a diphthong. A diphthong is a pair of two vowels which are considered to be one syllable, like the EI in bien and the AU in causa. The I and the U are considered weak vowels. When there is a weak vowel with a strong vowel, then they make a diphthong, and they are considered to be just one syllable. But when a word has a weak vowel with a strong vowel, but the weak vowel is its own syllable, then we need to write an accent mark above it, such as in dia, dia, day, dia. If it didn't have the accent mark, it would be dia, but it's not dia, it's dia, and so we have to write the accent mark above the I, dia. It's the same in Maria. Without the accent mark above the I, it wouldn't be Maria, it would be Maria. But we don't want it to be Maria, we want it to be Maria, and so we have to put an accent mark above the I, Maria. Baúl, baúl. In this word, we put an accent mark above the U to make it its own syllable, baúl, because if it didn't have it, it would be baúl and not baúl. But we don't want that. We want baúl, and so we put an accent mark above the U. Frío, cold, frío. Same thing. If it didn't have an accent mark above the I, it would be frío. But we don't want it to be frío. We want it to be frío. And so we put an accent mark above the I, frío. So this rule makes sure that the word is pronounced with two distinct vowel sounds in two separate syllables as intended. Now, as I said before, we use accent marks to know how to pronounce words, or in other words, to know where to stress words, but we also use them to differentiate between words that are pronounced the same. One class of these words which are pronounced the same but mean somewhat different things are the interrogative words, question words, words like who, what, when, where, why, how many, how much. When we use these words to ask a question or make an exclamation, we must write an accent mark above the vowel. This helps us to tell them apart from their unaccented twins. So in Spanish, these words are quién, qué, cuál, por qué, dónde, cuándo, cómo, cuánto, y cuántos. When we use these words to ask a question or make an exclamation, we must write an accent mark above that vowel. When we don't use them to ask a question or make an exclamation, then we don't write an accent mark. So for example, if I say, ¿Qué estás haciendo? I put an accent mark above the E in ¿qué? Because it's a question. What are you doing? ¿Qué estás haciendo? But if I say, no me gusta lo que estás haciendo, I don't like what you're doing, then I don't write an accent mark above the E in ¿qué? Because it's not a question. Also, if I say, qué lástima, what a shame, qué lástima, I write an accent mark above the E because it's an exclamation, qué lástima. But if I say, es algo que lastima, it's something that hurts, I don't write an accent mark above the E in qué because it's not a question. Qué lástima, with an accent mark. Es algo que lastima, without an accent mark. If I say, ¿Cómo estás? How are you? I write an accent mark above the O in ¿cómo? Because it's a question. ¿Cómo estás? But if I say, él es como ella, he is like her, then I don't write an accent mark above the O in ¿cómo? Because it's not a question. ¿Cómo estás? With an accent mark. Él es como ella, without an accent mark. If I say no sé dónde está, then the O in donde gets an accent mark. This isn't a direct question, but it is an indirect question, and so it still gets an accent mark. No sé dónde está. But if I say está donde dije, it's where I said, then I don't put an accent mark above the O in donde because it's not either a direct question or an indirect question. It's just a statement. No sé dónde está, accent mark. Está donde dije, no accent mark. So if I'm asking a direct or an indirect question, or I'm making an exclamation, these words need an accent mark. Now, there are other words with which we use an accent mark or not in order to differentiate between two words that are pronounced the same but don't mean the same thing. These are usually short, common words, very common words. And so you really need to understand the difference between these words with or without an accent mark. Let's look at some of the most important pairs. We have el with an accent mark or el without an accent mark. With an accent mark, it means he, and without an accent mark, it means the. So for example, I could say, él tiene el libro. He has the book. El with an accent mark is he, and el without it is the. Él tiene el libro. He has the book. We have tú with an accent mark and tú without the accent mark. Tú with the accent mark means you, and tú without the accent mark means your, the possessive pronoun your. So I could ask, ¿tú tienes tu mochila? Do you have your backpack? ¿Tú tienes tu mochila? ¿Tú tienes, do you have tu mochila, your backpack? ¿Tú tienes tu mochila? We have me with an accent mark and me without an accent mark. Me with an accent mark means me when it comes after a pronoun. And me without an accent mark means my. So I would say, este regalo es para mí. I write it with an accent mark because it means me and it comes after a preposition, para. Este regalo es para mí. But if I say, it's mi regalo, it's my gift, then I write it without an accent mark because it means my. Es mi regalo. Este regalo es para mí with an accent mark. Es mi regalo without an accent mark. We have sí with an accent mark and sí without an accent mark. With an accent mark, it means yes. And without an accent mark, it means if. I could say, si tú vas, entonces sí quiero ir. If you go, then yes, I want to go. Si tú vas, entonces sí quiero ir. The first sí means if, because it doesn't have an accent mark. And the second sí means yes, because it does have an accent mark. Si tú vas, entonces sí quiero ir. We have te with an accent mark and te without an accent mark. Te with an accent mark means T, and te without an accent mark means you. It's the object pronoun for you. So I could say, ¿Quieres que te sirva una taza de té? ¿Quieres que te sirva una taza de té? The first te doesn't have an accent mark because it's the object pronoun you. Do you want me to serve you? And the second te has an accent mark because it means tea, a cup of tea. ¿Quieres que te sirva una taza de té? We have más with an accent mark and más without an accent mark. Más with an accent mark means more, and más without an accent mark means but. It's more of a formal or literary but. Normally we say pero for but we could also say más. So for example, necesito más tiempo, mas no lo tengo. Necesito más tiempo, mas no lo tengo. I need more time, but I don't have it. The first más has an accent mark because it means more, and the second más doesn't have an accent mark because it means but. Necesito más tiempo, mas no lo tengo. Memorizing these pairs of words is a must because they are very common and you need to know how to differentiate them as you write. Well, that was a lot of info, right? But hopefully you're starting to see the patterns and the logic behind Spanish accent marks. It's not just random scribbles. It's a system designed to make things clearer. So let's do a super quick recap. We use accent marks to break natural stress rules. For words that are stressed on the last syllable but end in a vowel, an N or an S. And for words that are stressed on the second to last syllable but end in a different consonant besides N or S. And also for all words that have a stress before the second to last syllable. We use them for question or exclamation words like quién, qué, dónde, cuándo, etc., when they're actually being used to ask a question or make an exclamation. We use them to differentiate words that are pronounced the same but have different meanings. Think él y él, tú y tú, sí y sí, and so on. And they're also used to break up diphthongs when a weak vowel next to a strong vowel needs to be its own syllable. So, just like with anything else, the absolute best way to get these rules down is with practice. Start noticing accent marks when you're reading in Spanish. Ask yourself, why is this accent mark here? Does it break a natural stress pattern? Is it a question word? Is it there to tell the word apart from a different word that is pronounced the same? Also, when you write, try to actively apply these rules. It'll be slow going at first, but as you continue to practice, it'll become second nature. So, practice, 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 and don't be afraid to make mistakes. And that's our class for today. I hope this class was helpful and useful for you. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, well, subscribe so that you don't miss any classes. See you next time.